Title: Joseph, From the Pit to the Palace. Hookline: what would you do if you were betrayed by your own family, sold into slavery, and imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit? Could you still trust in God's plan? This is the story of Joseph, a man who faced unimaginable trials but discovered that God was with him every step of the way. Our story begins in the land of Canaan, where a young man named Joseph was growing up in a large and complicated family. Joseph was the 11th of 12 sons born to Jacob, also known as Israel, and he was his father's favorite. Jacob had shown his special love for Joseph by giving him a beautiful, richly ornamented coat, something that would set Joseph apart from his brothers. And this favoritism, as you might imagine, didn't sit well with his older brothers. To make matters worse, Joseph began having vivid dreams that seemed to suggest that one day he would rise to a position of power, even over his family. In one dream, Joseph saw bundles of grain in a field, and his brothers' bundles bowed down to his. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing before him. When Joseph shared these dreams with his brothers, their jealousy and hatred only grew. "Do you really think you'll rule over us?" they sneered. Their anger was so intense that they began to plot against him. Betrayed and sold into slavery? One day, when Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers who were tending the flocks, they saw an opportunity to get rid of him. As Joseph approached, his brothers plotted to kill him and throw his body into a pit. But one of the older brothers, Reuben, convinced them not to kill Joseph outright. Instead, they stripped him of his beautiful coat and threw him into an empty cistern, leaving him to die of thirst. But as fate would have it, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders came by on their way to Egypt. Seeing a chance to profit from their hatred, the brothers decided to sell Joseph as a slave for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph, just a teenager, was now a slave, taken far from his home and family. His brothers dipped his coat in goat's blood and brought it back to their father Jacob, pretending that a wild animal had killed him. Jacob was devastated. His beloved son was gone, or so he thought. Joseph in Egypt, the rise and fall. Joseph's journey took him to Egypt, where he was sold to a man named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Though Joseph was now a slave in a foreign land, he soon found favor in Potiphar's eyes. Potiphar recognized that Joseph was a man of integrity, and he could see that everything Joseph did prospered. In fact, the Bible tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, even in his lowest moments, blessing him with wisdom and success. Potiphar was so impressed with Joseph that he made him the overseer of his entire household. Joseph was in charge of everything Potiphar owned, and under Joseph's management, Potiphar's household flourished. It seemed that even as a slave, Joseph was rising to a position of influence and trust. But just when things seemed to be going well, trouble found Joseph once again. Potiphar's wife, taken by Joseph's good looks, tried to seduce him. Day after day, she attempted to lure him into sin, but Joseph, a man of strong morals and faith, refused. "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" he said. Enraged by his rejection, Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attacking her. When Potiphar heard this, his anger burned, and he had Joseph thrown into prison. Imprisoned but not forgotten. Imagine being Joseph in that moment, betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, and now imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. It would have been easy for Joseph to give up, to believe that God had abandoned him. But even in prison, the Lord was with Joseph. God granted Joseph favor in the eyes of the prison warden, who quickly placed him in charge of all the prisoners. Joseph's natural leadership and integrity shone through, and once again, everything he did prospered. Even in the depths of prison, Joseph remained faithful, trusting in God's plan. One day, two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, were thrown into the same prison. Both men had troubling dreams, and Joseph, recognizing that interpretations belonged to God, offered to help. The cupbearer dreamt of 3 branches on a vine that blossomed and produced grapes. Joseph told him that in 3 days, he would be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. Encouraged by this positive interpretation, the baker shared his dream of 3 baskets of bread on his head, with birds eating from them. But Joseph's interpretation was grim. In 3 days, the baker would be executed. Both dreams came true, just as Joseph had said. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to Pharaoh's service, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph, leaving him in prison for 2 more long years. From the prison to the palace. But Joseph's time of waiting was not in vain. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had a series of troubling dreams that no one in his court could interpret. In his dreams, Pharaoh saw 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 lean cows, and 7 healthy ears of grain being consumed by 7 withered ears. Disturbed by the dreams, Pharaoh searched for someone who could explain their meaning. It was then that the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings," he said, and told Pharaoh about the young Hebrew slave who had interpreted dreams in prison. Pharaoh immediately summoned Joseph, and after shaving and changing clothes, Joseph stood before the most powerful ruler in the world. Pharaoh explained his dreams, and Joseph, with wisdom from God, gave the interpretation. The 7 good cows and the 7 good ears of grain represent 7 years of abundance in Egypt, but the 7 lean cows and the 7 withered ears of grain represent 7 years of famine that will follow. The famine will be so severe that the years of plenty will be forgotten. Joseph didn't stop there. He also offered a solution. He advised Pharaoh to store up surplus grain during the 7 years of abundance so that Egypt would have enough food during the famine. Pharaoh, recognizing the Spirit of God in Joseph, appointed him as the second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph, the boy who had been sold as a slave and imprisoned for years, was now elevated to a position of incredible power. He was given fine clothes, a royal signet ring, and authority over the entire land. Reunion and forgiveness. Just as Joseph had predicted, the 7 years of abundance came, followed by a severe famine that spread not only through Egypt, but to surrounding nations as well. People from all over came to Egypt to buy grain, including Joseph's brothers, who had no idea their long-lost brother was now the ruler of Egypt. When Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed before him, fulfilling the dreams he had as a boy. But Joseph did not reveal himself right away. Instead, he tested his brothers to see if their hearts had changed. After a series of interactions, Joseph was overcome with emotion. He could no longer hide who he was. "I am Joseph," he cried. "Is my father still alive?" His brothers were stunned and terrified, remembering what they had done to him years ago. But Joseph, filled with forgiveness and understanding, told them not to be afraid. "You intended to harm me," he said, "but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's words were profound. He recognized that even in the darkest moments of his life, God had a greater plan at work. What seemed like tragedy after tragedy was all part of God's design to place Joseph in a position where he could save not only Egypt, but also his own family from the famine. Joseph invited his entire family, including his father Jacob, to come and live in Egypt, where they were given the best land and plenty of food. It was a joyful reunion, and Joseph's story became one of reconciliation, redemption, and the incredible ways that God works through even the most painful circumstances. Final thoughts. The story of Joseph is a powerful reminder that no matter what trials we face in life, God is always with us. Even when we don't understand what's happening, God is working behind the scenes, turning our struggles into opportunities for growth, redemption, and purpose. Joseph's life shows us that faith, perseverance, and forgiveness can lead to great blessing, even when the road is difficult. For more stories of faith, inspiration, and ancient wisdom, don't forget to follow Nano Myths, where timeless tales continue to inspire and transform.